Heyo, hi, hello, I'm Hippie Rat, and those of you who are my age today may share a set of shows we look back on rather fondly. Now, I was born into the first stirrings of Generation Z, and with it I grew up on such classics as SpongeBob and Blue's Clues over the first half of the Double O's decade, before moving on and growing attached to programs created in the mid to late years of the same decade. Some particular examples of shows I found myself enjoying consistently at this time include Ned's Declassified, School Survival Guide, Ben 10, The Sweet Life, Phineas and Ferb, Chowder, Wizards of Waverly Place, iCarly, and a few more to round it out. I wasn't far into the next decade, the 20-teens, however, that I found myself supplementing just about all of my entertainment with YouTube, but not before spending some time enjoying such classics as Regular Show and The Amazing World of Gumball. But what is of note is that during this stretch of time, during this run of shows so fondly held to by ever-aging fellow souls, one series that grabbed my attention and refused to let go just hasn't done the same to nearly anybody I know. In fact, almost everyone I ask about this show expresses nothing but confusion and query over what this mysterious televised anomaly is, as if I just made the claim that Candle Cove was a real TV show, Channel Zero notwithstanding. This is all in spite of this show having aired on Nickelodeon. You know, the motherfucking SpongeBob channel. Do you guys remember the season 3 premiere of iCarly? It was called I Think They Kissed, featuring the dramatic arc of the show, where Carly becomes privy to the famous kiss shared between Freddie and Sam in the previous season. It was kind of a big deal during a show that we all remember in hilariously vivid detail. Now that I've jogged your memory on a special episode, given rather egregious hype by the channel leading up to its premiere, I want you to try your darndest to answer me this. What aired directly after that episode? This isn't a trick, it wasn't some rerun of a True Jackson VP episode or anything. Part of the hype regarding this night, September 12th, 2009, involved this other very special premiere occurring directly after this episode aired. So, what was it? You might still be struggling, so let me give you a quick play-by-play. But first, I want you to take a quick moment to check if you're subscribed. I'm working towards some subscriber goals this year, 10,000 by the end of the year, and I'll be doing a video on Undertale. 20,000, and I'll also do a video on Tattletale. If we don't quite hit those goals in time, don't worry too much. I'll keep those video ideas up as goals to reach, but it's up to you how soon we'll be tackling those topics on this channel, and I would really appreciate your help sending that number up. And now, without further ado, Jake Collins heads out for school, performing a death-defying stunt to stop the bus for his little sister after having a run-in with Mr. Burker, a volunteer law enforcer and rather unpleasant neighbor who confiscates every belonging that winds up on his lawn. He is literally the most obnoxious person I could have imagined at both age 9 and age 21. As Jake skateboards his way to school, Mr. Burker sees off his wife as she heads for her beauty retreat. However, she becomes distracted by the sound of a strange animal in the woods near their home and goes to investigate, only to be attacked and subsequently turned to stone, initiating the main title sequence. This is Nickelodeon's nearly buried 2009 action television show, The Troop. At school, Nicholas Purcell's Jake Collins awaits the results of his aptitude test, a school-mandated standardized test meant to determine a student's strengths and weaknesses, such as to provide them a direction in which they are advised to take their careers. While most students receive their results in Mr. Stockley's office, the assistant vice principal, played by John Marshall Jones, instead takes Jake to the gymnasium to be introduced to two other students, Felix Garcia, played by David Del Rio, is a nerdy guy who tries a bit too hard to come across as cool and suave, and recently was assigned as Jake's science partner. Hayley Steele, played by Gage Golightly, is one of the most popular girls in school, and someone Jake has had a crush on for a long while, as implied by an interaction they had while he had his locker relocated near hers after his was inexplicably flooded. Stockley reveals to Jake that these two events were no coincidence, and were conducted in order to bring him closer to Felix and Hayley and initiate more social experiences with them so as to not raise suspicion over why they're suddenly hanging out together. That suspicion is imperative for a secret organization of monster hunters to avoid, after all. Yes, as Stockley reveals with the unveiling of a series of cells holding imprisoned magical creatures under the gym, Jake has passed a secret aspect of the aptitude test that makes him a worthy recruit into the Lakewood division of a secret organization known simply as the Troop, an international system of high school students hunting monsters with the key focus of secrecy from the public so as to not elicit any panic that would make their work more difficult. Jake accepts the request to have him join the Troop, and a significant portion of the rest of the episode centers around himself getting acclimated to the task set out for him. The rest of the episode follows up on the strange supernatural event we saw in the cold open. Mr. Burker investigates a similar roar in the woods, finding his wife's statue deformed before being turned to stone by the same beast. Jake enters the woods himself and discovers a squirrel that similarly fell victim to this mysterious creature. Upon further investigation later, he finds the Burkers, breaking off Mr. Burker's ponytail and accidentally decapitating Mrs. Burker, who, if she wasn't already dead, is now very, very dead. With this information, they are able to confirm this monster to be a basilisk, a bird-like reptile that turns anyone who looks at it to stone, which can be killed by seeing itself in a mirror, which would in turn reverse its effects on its victims, so long as those victims hadn't been turned to stone more than 48 hours previously. During the hunt, Jake becomes impatient and rendezvous with Hayley and Felix to suggest just blasting the monster, leaving the mirrors they were hiding open to attack. The basilisk shatters the mirrors, and Jake sparks a good idea to balance out his previous bad idea. Hayley leaves herself behind as a distraction, sacrificing herself to allow Jake to make it back to the statues and find Mr. Burker's reflective sunglasses. He puts them on and faces the basilisk, turning it to stone once it sees its own reflection, at which point it topples and shatters. The episode ends with Hayley, turned back to flesh, celebrating with Jake and Felix over a successful hunt, before Jake comes up with the bright idea to duct tape Mr. Burker's ponytail back on as a mustache before he turns back, which Mrs. Burker chastises him for when she also turns back, having been saved by the duct tape used to put her head back on her neck when in statue form, because the alternative denouement would have likely been too grisly. Jake rescues his drawing and his sister's toys from Mr. Burker's collection of confiscated items, and they laugh together at his plight. And that was Welcome to the Jungle, the pilot episode of The Troop. The Troop premiered in the second half of 2009, and its first season was released up through August of the next year. I remember fondly being attached to this show, quite a significant hyperfixation of mine as a kid, but one I hadn't been able to return to until recently due to low coverage and distribution of it. There was something so enthralling to me about this concept that in high school there was a secret society of students trained to secretly kill or capture monsters that cause strange paranormal events around town. Perhaps it was due to my existing interest in the concept of the paranormal that I began looking into around that age, and perhaps it became something I clinged onto so heavily as a result of my desire to study the paranormal more directly one day by going ghost hunting or searching for cryptids, just twisted into a more extreme premise for the greatest dramatic value. What I do know is that once this show began release, you could find me watching it religiously and constantly checking the supplementary website troopgrid.com to study up and prepare to become an official troop member when I got to high school. Imagine how disappointed I was to then find out that high school was actually traumatizing. in hindsight, it's not necessarily the single most original concept ever, especially in its time. The Troop was not the first to introduce a Monster of the Week format to children's programming, as we'd seen from preceding contemporaries like Courage the Cowardly Dog or Ben 10. It also wasn't the first to conceptualize the idea of bringing adolescents with special abilities into the action organized by secret agencies or eccentric individuals. See Spy Kids or Animorphs. And it certainly was not the first to do both of those at once, like Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, or the Sarah Jane Chronicles. Even following the release of the Troop, television shows like Level Up came about to further establish a banality that the Troop had found itself trapped in that perhaps kept it so obscure up until now. Hence why I'm returning to this show today. I really liked the Troop a lot when I was younger, and there was potential for me to reignite a spark with this that I could use to inspire my own works in the future. Now, I was hopeful upon returning to this episode, but I wanted to remain somewhat skeptical so that if the series and its comedy and action and stuff didn't hold up to my expectations, I wouldn't be too disappointed. And surprisingly enough, I don't think I needed to be as skeptical as I was. There's some comedy that doesn't necessarily happen to land, but I feel like when the show does hit a good zinger, you feel it. There's one scene here in this episode where Mr. Stockley gives Jake the manual for monster hunting, warning him that it's a bit outdated beforehand. A few minutes later, Jake can be seen studying the manual, and plastered on the page in front of him, Monsters versus Commies. Who's the real danger? And that's pretty funny, a neat jab at Red Scare America, so caught up in the fear of an ideology built against the idea of the individual people gaining riches in return for the suffering of the masses, that they would consider it equally as threatening to the American way of life as literal monsters who eat people. But, well, as humorous as it is, I feel like it accidentally serves to exemplify a core issue with the premise of the series and what it really represents. If you don't mind, I'm gonna talk about something a bit more deep that I've realized while watching this, and then we can get back to the fun part of the video where I ogle at cool monster designs. Now, as is the case with most speculative media about the recruitment of teenagers into a secret organization of crime-fighting superhero monster slayers, the justification that exists in fiction is that teenagers have well-developed physical ability, coupled with the mental acuity to accept the circumstances of and learn the complexities of these fantastical concepts much better than adults ever could. And great. That's all well and good, some mindless fun Harry Potter bullshit for my 10-year-old self to aspire to, but if I can remove my rose-tinted glasses for just a moment, I recognize the insidious mark of the United States military-industrial complex anywhere. Mr. Stockley may present himself as a lovable hug of a dude, but he's just the type of advisor to strongly hint to students with underperforming grade point averages that they should speak to the military recruiter visiting the school that week. And with this show's depiction of secret combat initiatives as these radical stunt shows with impressive high-tech equipment, you're left to turn a blind eye to the clear, impassive danger that those who become part of the Troop engage in. In No More Master Nice Guy, we are introduced to a particularly dangerous monster, the Duelist, whose history includes the Lakewood Troop of 1958 becoming the first to ever capture one, at the cost of one member's life. And this is not an isolated incident, the one time someone in any troop was killed by a monster. It's just the one that happens to be linked to the troop we follow in the series. Several of the creatures documented in the troop's database of monsters are well established to be extremely dangerous, and almost all of them have been studied to a point of understanding the strict limitations to their danger. I'm just saying, you break a few eggs to make an omelet, and you get a few teenagers turned to stone forever to learn that you have 48 hours to save a basilisk's victims. Here's the bitter truth about this world. They are sending kids to die. Now that begs the question, why would anyone ever let a child put themselves into such a dangerous battlefield? And that's where things start to get a bit imperialist, because we are left to assume that if teenagers are the most capable of defeating the monsters, then removing them from the equation would allow monsters to terrorize and kill innocent people left and right. That makes sense, right? After all, the entire series plays within the continuous structure of a monster arriving in Lakewood, posing a direct threat to several people, and being destroyed or captured by these teenagers. It's reasonable to pull the lever on this trolley problem when the premise is this outlandish and the teenagers putting their lives on the line are recognizable as the only option. However, if we were to translate this conclusion to the aspect of reality that this premise reflects, the statement we arrive at is that we must send teenagers to risk their lives as soldiers in our military, because if we don't, then we are putting the lives of every innocent American civilian at risk from extremely dangerous monsters who exist to terrorize and kill. And that's just fucking racist. But it's a common assumption in post-9/11 American culture because we have had the privilege of being the inflictors of terrorism for most of our recent history rather than the receivers. And the one time we saw an attack on the homeland in the past 80 years, it threatened our comfort to such a degree that we still use it to justify countless destruction and murder 20 years later. As we have been conditioned to believe, the instant we loosen our grip on the Middle East and seize our military intervention, they immediately become a danger upon our everyday lives, and by God, the last thing you want to do is inconvenience a white person who wants to go buy a pack of fucking Oreos. I want to reiterate that this is a kids show. This is what I grew up with. I fucking love this show. And even this is laden with white supremacy propaganda, however incidental. In case you ever had any questions regarding how deeply ingrained we are brainwashed by the tyrannical US of A, consider this just one in a laundry list of examples. Anyway, the Duelist looks pretty cool, huh? So far, we've dived deep into Welcome to the Jungle, the pilot of the series, which introduces Jake as a rookie to the troop. Essentially, an audience surrogate that justifies a consistent string of exposition. Jake gets pretty well acclimated to the team after one other episode. There Is No I in Monster Hunter was the second episode developed for the series, and follows up on a character trait hinted at in the previous. You remember how Jake got antsy and left the mirrors unguarded and vulnerable to an attack from the basilisk? In that episode, it's kind of brushed aside for the celebration, since Jake's ingenuity ultimately saves the day, but this ends up getting resolved here as Jake goes against protocol to trap a fire salamander, a combustible creature that explodes when put under the stress of a dark enclosed space, like Jake's backpack. The scent of the fire salamander goo attracts a giant ravenous repticore, a large frog-like creature. Jake is reprimanded for his poor handling of the fire salamander, and not allowed to engage with the rest of the troop's involvement in international monster hunting for the time being. Pent up and wanting his fix of the thrill of the chase, Jake heads off into the woods by himself to take the repticore on alone, upon overhearing the team deducing one to be in the vicinity, without reading up on the effective way to defeat it. As a result, it eats him, and he has to wait in the stomach for Felix and Hayley to arrive with a bomb to affix to its stomach lining that would properly destroy it. During this ordeal, he learns that maybe the real monster hunters were the friends we made along the way, but like literally. From here on out, the show becomes less about training the new guy to fight monsters, although the fact that he's still a rookie member is never tossed completely to the side. Instead, this is where the troupe really fully transitions into a show that is one half high school comedy drama, one half monster hunting action adventure. Do the Worm is probably the most iconic episode to demonstrate this dichotomy. In this episode, a Mongolian death worm finds its way to Lakewood. This burrowing monster hunts by tracking vibrations, which is particularly bad because the senior dance is going to happen that night, and the music would attract the worm. So Felix concocts a plan to strap a bomb to a washing machine as bait to explode the worm, only for it to backfire by causing the worm to split into 3 identical monsters. Now the troupe has to go with a backup plan that involves setting up electric charges in the speakers at the dance to properly destroy the worms. Luckily, Hayley will already be going to the dance since she's one senior's date, and Felix will also be there since he's part of the AV club that's in charge of DJing. So now Jake needs to either ask out the only senior not going to the dance yet, a particularly frightening girl named Brittany, or he needs to join the AV club with Felix. This is exactly what I'm talking about. While most high school shows arbitrarily function around conflicts like, the lead character really needs a date to the dance, the troupe plays in a similar space, but makes the stakes and purposes around the conflicts completely different. It almost plays off like a subtle parody of those kinds of shows that ran concurrently with the troupe at the time. A sort of satire on how these characters act, like getting a date to the dance, or getting a good grade on a science project, or hitting it off with the popular kids, are matters of life and death. Ultimately, Jake is unable to impress the AV club to allow him to join, leaving him to ask out Brittany. She has an attitude you'd just about expect from how she carried herself previously, although things start to look up when Jake spends some time with Brittany and they discover a mutual fondness for comic books. Meanwhile, Hayley stalls the Deathworms from heading toward the dance by convincing Etienne, a somewhat recurring goofball character, to play more and more slow dance songs rather than club hits, much to the chagrin of the seniors. This culminates in your classic romantic misunderstanding when her date catches her dancing and flirting with Etienne to secretly protect them all from the monsters. Felix also finds himself in a silly high school TV show situation as a bully brings him to a classroom and ties him to the ceiling with a bunch of his cables and wires. With the troupe unable to contain the stirring senior class any further, Etienne begins playing more energetic music, causing the ground beneath them to rumble. Once he's freed from his cables, Felix temporarily incapacitates the worms with a specific audio frequency, long enough for him to announce to the senior class what's going on and how to protect themselves. He then reactivates the music and manages to keep everyone away while the worms surface and are subsequently electrocuted to death by his device. In response, the senior class begins cheering for Felix and holding him up like the end of Rudy, giving him a moment to be recognized as a hero. And then Mr. Stockley arrives with a box that we will become very familiar with throughout the series. So one of the core tenements of the troupe is that they must never let the public know that there are monsters or there would be mass panic. They are predictably bad at this. In The Great Punkin, Felix dresses as a photorealistic gibbering Trueless for Halloween, only to come face to face with an actual gibbering Trueless. His reaction is not that this is an actual gibbering Trueless, but that this is someone in another photorealistic gibbering Trueless costume. To which I wonder, does Felix remember that the monster he's dressed as actually exists, and there's a non-zero chance for him to see one at any random point? Or does he find the likelihood of classified troupe information becoming public knowledge just that much higher? On an unrelated note, here is a clip of a bunch of grown men chanting a song about having been in the troupe loudly in the middle of a crowded restaurant.
We are the troupe, yeah, the mighty troupe, yeah, and we ain't scared of monsters.
This scene from Do the Worm, of Felix being regarded as a hero for saving everyone from a bunch of dangerous monsters, is the show's first big exploration of conflict involving people becoming wise to the troop's actions and how they normally solve that issue. You see, the box that Mr. Stockley is holding contains a snark, a small monster that sings a sonorous note that wipes people's recent memories, kind of like their version of the neuralizer from Men in Black. And so Jake and Hayley solemnly put in their earplugs, understanding the disappointment Felix must feel and knowing how temporary this moment of praise will be. And he does object for a moment before putting in his earplugs as well, and allowing everyone to get snarked. This, unfortunately, includes Brittany, who now remembers none of the good times she had with Jake during this dance, but fortunately includes Brad, Hayley's date, who now doesn't remember her interactions with Etienne. Mr. Stockley blames the damages on a plumbing leak and sends everyone home. What this episode does really well is more fully develop the characters into more dynamic people that helps us really understand the goals and conflicts that will most affect them in the coming episodes. In Felix's case, his life outside of the troop usually involves him trying to fit in or prove himself to people who don't respect him. In Hayley's case, she discovers points of tension between herself and her peers and struggles to fix those issues while also achieving in school. Jake's a bit more fluid and nebulous, being kind of the everyman who can sometimes be driven by a desire to protect his friends, sometimes to prove himself as competent, and sometimes he's just put in a situation to learn a lesson. In all of these cases, shenanigans around the troop tend to amplify these conflicts in quite a narratively satisfying way. A weaker show would naturally default to an A plot about monster hunting and a B plot about high school drama, and I will admit that this show falls into that trap itself sometimes, and there are some episodes that abandon most of the monster hunting element for high school drama and vice versa, but those kinds of episodes just keep things dynamic. Generally speaking, there's a very nice interwoven nature between the two main elements of the plot that makes the premise of the series feel very well justified. Now, when I covered the main goals and ambitions for each character, I didn't quite explore Mr. Stockley. And that's because Mr. Stockley, he kind of has a strange position in the series. You see, in the first few episodes, he serves as the wise sage, giving the troop tips and advice and other general help.
Great. Now I go back to being plain old Felix. Nobody will remember what happened here today.
I will.
However, there's a very quick shift after those first few episodes where he becomes flanderized into a bit of a clown.
May I get back to squeezing every drop of beauty out of this day?
Are you watching cartoons?
I gotta go.
At this point, any episode where all three troop members share a specific A plot typically includes a B plot of Stockley shenanigans. Like when he tried to get back with his date who walked out on him because he screamed a bunch upon running over a scarecrow. Or when he went to a silent meditation retreat and instigated a riot. Or when he spent a whole ass episode listening to the Magnus archives in his car. One pattern that arises out of the Stockley shenanigans later in the season is a specific focus in his actions as assistant vice principal and a drive to do his job well. In Wrath of the Wraith, he must face the dire B-plot of needing to tell a student's parents that the kid will be held back a grade, only for the father to be very welcoming and honored to meet him, reflect on their shared past at Camp Winnipesaukee, and share a dinner with him, making the news that much harder to break. In Vampsters, Stockley has to replace Mr. Friedberg in doing the morning announcements, something he's excited to do, but extremely nervous due to the high likelihood of saying something wrong.
That's it for today. Wishing you a wonderful morning, this is Mr. Stinkley.
After most of a couple dozen episodes where Stockley has been the goofball, incompetent adult archetype, he finally gets a big hero moment in the episode Batteries Not Included, the penultimate episode of the first season. In this, Felix and Jake bag a monster that doesn't show up on their databases, meaning they have little understanding of how it operates. Felix offers to call it the Anita Garcia, after his grandmother, but the name that ends up in the database, according to the old supplementary website, is Jake's suggestion, the Oculips. This half-crab, half-scorpion creature breaks out of the container the boys were escorting it in, freeing it loose upon Lakewood High, leaving the troop to discover what it's capable of and how to recapture it on their own. Meanwhile, Mr. Stockley receives word that Principal Nuss has come down with strep throat, making Stockley acting principal for the week. When he goes to tell the boys, the Oculips stabs him in the neck with its stinger, temporarily paralyzing him from the neck down. As Hayley and Jake go to catch the Oculips, they discover dozens of students similarly paralyzed, with strange discs laid next to them. After some analysis, they discover that the paralyzing agent works for approximately 6 hours, and this thing shits out frisbees that explode when exposed to enough light, spraying the victim with a slow-acting acid to liquefy them for the Oculips to return to and feed on. After a long while, they find and recapture the Oculips, leaving several temporarily paralyzed students and a large cooler full of frisbee shits unattended to. Meanwhile, Felix is enlisted as Mr. Stockley's assistant while he deals with his paralysis. While trying to get him to sit at his desk properly, Miss Wall, the superintendent, arrives to do a surprise inspection of the school and the way it is being run. This necessitates a more direct administrative role from Stockley, so Felix lends him an invention he built some time ago, a robotic suit designed to help his 80-year-old grandfather dance on his birthday. Unfortunately, he struggles to reprogram the suit to do simple walking and grabbing animations, making Stockley's only means of transport throughout the episode various dances, which, yes, does make him look like an absolute clown in front of the superintendent. At one point, the cooler holding the frisbee shits is found and confiscated by Miss Wall and haphazardly thrown into a waste bin in the teacher's lounge near a window. When Jake and Hayley return to the cooler and find that the frisbee shits are gone, they realize that if any one of them explode now, it could cause a chain reaction that would take down the entire school. So they pull the fire alarm and take it upon themselves to evacuate the paralyzed students. Meanwhile, Mr. Stockley is reprimanded for the chaos Miss Wall saw that day, and he decides to find the frisbee shits before it's too late so that he doesn't go down as the man who blew up the school on his first day as principal. So as the troop are sent out of the building with Miss Wall, Felix directs Mr. Stockley to the teacher's lounge with his remote control, only for the batteries on the suit to finally run out, rendering Mr. Stockley once again paralyzed and alone next to the entire stack of frisbee shits as the sunlight slowly creeps through the window towards them. Mustering all the strength he has within him, he pushes through the paralysis to throw his retractable keychain around the handle of the refrigerator and pull the fridge down on top of the frisbee shits just in time to contain the explosion, saving the school. I mentioned batteries not included partially to discuss Stockley's character and spotlight his shining moment here in the season, but also because of something I only just now clocked upon rewatch of the series this many years later. I mentioned before how the Oculips had previously never been discovered by the troop, which created a tense situation where the characters had no idea what they were getting into in terms of containing it, and it gave Jake the honor of coining the name that the monster would be given. But I want to backpedal to an episode we already covered. The pilot episode, in fact. After discovering the stone squirrel, Mr. Stockley uses the troop grid to narrow down their search to 5 different monsters: the cockatrice, the amphesian, the medusa, the basilisk, and the kalamabi. However, the images that flash on the screen don't quite line up with what he's saying. It's harder to see on the first 2, but when he says cockatrice, we're shown the overminds, and when he says amphesian, we're shown the thought eater. The troop grid is off screen until he gets to the basilisk, which looks accurate, essentially because it was the only screen written into this particular episode that was prepared beforehand. Now, this is kind of an ignorable mistake. It's less an error and more a cut corner that you really aren't supposed to pay much mind to. But when you consider the monster that is depicted very prominently on the screen when he rounds out the list, you could see that I just can't help it. Yeah, that's the Oculops. Yeah, that's the monster that the troop grid doesn't know exists. So, not only is this Jake's introduction to the troop, placing it well before the events of Batteries Not Included, but when the Lakewood troop supposedly discovers the monster for the first time in troop history, Jake happens to invent the same name that shows up in this database entry that, for all intents and purposes, should not fucking exist. This goes beyond a simple production error. This monster might straight up be a reality-bending SCP that can pull a new universe out its ass like a goddamn frisbee. Did somebody say SCP? Yeah, we could talk about that for a bit. One of the biggest critiques I regularly assign to the lore of famed collaborative creepypasta mythos, the SCP Foundation, is the sheer scope of the project. As of making this video, the website is floating around 6,000 main series entries, with an amount of other anomalous pieces of lore that I do not wish to collect at this time. There are safely more than 6,000, perhaps even 7,000, anomalous nouns recorded and contained in some way by this fictional shadow organization. And that's ridiculous. Like, that's a lot. And there's more being added constantly. And so many of these things are not containable because they're abstract concepts. At that point, you shouldn't be able to walk down the street without running into an SCP and having it turn you into a writhing mass of colors that don't exist or whatever the fuck. There is no chance that this secret organization and the things that it's designed to keep secret can reasonably be kept secret in this world. Now, I discuss this because there comes a point where the necessity to keep civilians in the dark about what's going on behind the wainscots becomes irrelevant due to the complexity of the conspiracy at hand. It's reasonable to imagine wizards and vampires living in regular society in secret because they're sentient and recognize the purpose in keeping themselves hidden. SCP is much more difficult to reason because the masquerade is suggested to have to cover so much ground in a way that is hard to suspend disbelief for. And frankly, I think the troop suffers from the exact same problem. In the last segment, I listed 5 different monsters who have the ability to turn people and animals into stone. 5 different species. And monsters are a weirdly common occurrence in this world. There's constant mention of troop activity all over the world, all of whom are dealing with their own creature outbreak pretty constantly at presumably a similar rate as the Lakewood troop. And what is that rate? Well, they don't call it Monster of the Week for nothing. There's just something about the knowledge of 5 different monsters that can turn people to stone, at least one of which does so just by having you look at it, that makes you reach a conclusion that, you're fucked. Like, dude, I can turn to literal stone just by looking at a stupid fucking lizard chicken. And there's one of them shits walking around town every few months. I can get eaten by a giant worm just because I dropped a pencil on the ground in front of me. Just last week, me and the rest of the entire fucking town got turned into happy zombies by a swarm of weird flies, and our brains almost melted. I am in constant danger of being killed in bizarre and grisly ways just going to the bus stop. And the fact that monsters and troops have been able to remain hidden to a reasonable degree for so long is preposterous. So now I know what you're thinking. What happens when someone finds out? You know, like, really finds out. Surely there must be some examples of people witnessing a monster attack and flying under the troop's radar so they don't get snarked. Well, as a matter of fact, there are a couple examples. In Like a Moth to the Spotlight, Etienne and Angie, a girl who aspires to become a famous reporter, witness the troop failing to kill a vampire moth, and they sneak out before the troop can snark them. Throughout the episode, they challenge the troop and their attempted cover-up of Mime Club, all while the vampire moth is still active. In the end, they attempt to catch the moth on camera, only for it to not show up because of its power to distort electromagnetic frequencies. And then they finally get snarked. But wait, if the moth didn't show up on Angie's camera, how did it show up on Nickelodeon's camera? I only mentioned that episode because I would be remiss in discussing moments where the secret was let loose without being thorough, but I mainly put forward that premise in order to open discussion of one of the most significant moments in the series. The Gus trilogy. I've mentioned No More Master Nice Guy before, and the danger of the Duelist. Well, Duelist is a creature with the ability to turn invisible and a very high intelligence, although its instinct binds it into servitude of a master, the first person the Duelist sees after a given time. We are introduced to the Duelist at the end of the cold open, in which we meet an antsy teen named Gus, played by Chad Krawchuk, taking refuge from some bullies in an abandoned ice cream factory, where he accidentally unlocks an old troop containment cell holding the Duelist. It imprints on Gus and attacks the bullies, sending them running away. Throughout the episode, he becomes increasingly mad with power, tired of his old life of meekness now that he has a monster on his side. During his time with the Duelist, it tells him about the troop and how they trapped it, and how they'll want to do it again. Hayley, who had been supportive of Gus until he started becoming unhinged, eventually notices the Duelist when some bus exhaust makes it visible, and Gus, not willing to go back to his old life, orders the Duelist to kidnap Hayley and prepare to kill the rest of the troop. Meanwhile, Jake and Felix had been training in simulations constantly in order to prepare to fight the escaped Duelist, and hopefully not die, since Jake has let Felix down several times during these simulations so far. When the time comes to battle the monster, Felix decides to trust Jake and join him in taking down the Duelist, which they ultimately succeed in doing without any casualties. Gus is upset about going back to his old life until he gets snarked and sent home. However, in the final shot, it's revealed that Gus wore earplugs to avoid getting snarked, having been warned about it beforehand by the Duelist. For the next few months, Gus secretly spied on Jake, Felix, and Hayley in order to gather as much information on the troop as he could before finally making his move in the episode, My Gus is Back, and There's Gonna Be Trouble. Hey now, my Gus is back. In this episode, we are introduced to Dimension Mites, another monster used as a tool by the troop, like the snark. What Dimension Mites do is eat a hole in reality, creating a portal between Earth and the monster dimension. The episode opens with them using these mites to send some of their captured monsters back to the monster world, all while Gus watches from the bushes. After this, he invites Felix into a high school chapter of the Lakewood Society of Medieval Knights, taking a moment to steal Felix's troop card from his wallet, allowing him access into troop headquarters, where he leaves a large mess behind in his search for the Dimension Mites. He catches the ire of Jake, who begins to catch wise that he hadn't been snarked at all, but he struggles to get through to Felix, who just thinks Jake is jealous, and Hayley, who is busy trying to get herself to relax and unwind under orders from Mr. Stockley.
Just listen to the soothing sounds of the ocean. Whoosh.
Later, Gus brings Felix into his home, revealing to him his conspiracy theory red string corkboard of the troop, and monologuing how he plans to bring monsters over into their dimension and command them under his leadership in order to take over the world. He opens a portal in the bedroom, allowing a monster to come through to strangle Felix to death before moving on to the other two. He arrives at Jake's home next, opening another portal that lets in a quadrogob, which the Troop Grid website describes as one of the most dangerous monsters in existence for reasons I cannot fucking tell you, since they say the same thing about every other fucking monster they fight. Hayley arrives to help Jake, as does Felix, since the monster that seemed to attack him was actually a Huggy Bear, a harmless and affectionate creature. Felix throws the Huggy Bear onto the quadrogob, distracting it long enough for Jake to kick it back through the portal. They apprehend Gus, who warns them that if they snark him, he left himself notes and recordings to remind him of the troop, so they decide to deal with him another way. By having him committed. The episode ends with him ranting to the orderlies about the monsters and monster hunters, insisting that he is not delusional. This finally culminates in the Season 1 finale of the troop. The next stop, Lakewood. Gus is being evaluated over his progress so far in the hospital, being congratulated for his time spent becoming friends with a young man named Fredo, who is very clearly autistic-coded. We'll get there. He explains that Fredo helped him build a device that looks like a fucking cell phone bomb.
It's more like a dog whistle.
You could say that again. He reveals that the device is actually designed to call monsters to his aid and control them into submission as a group of monsters invade the hospital and allow Gus and Fredo to escape. Gus then spends weeks using the device to cause a surge of monster activity in Lakewood, overwhelming the troop and stirring agitation among them. He sends in a shape-shifting monster called a Locked, disguised as Dr. Brandenburg, the head of Troop International, to instruct the troop to temporarily shut down while they are put under review as a result of the recent ineptitude demonstrated by the team. Unfortunately for Gus, troop code requires headquarters to be locked down when under review. No one in or out. Hayley spends her time away from the troop to develop her resume with things that would look good on college applications, and Felix spends his time away from the troop getting a job at a frozen yogurt shop where he's respected by his peers and gets a chance to exhibit leadership. Meanwhile, Jake realizes immediately how bored he is when he isn't spending time with Felix and Hayley, whom he's developed strong bonds with over the course of the season. Gus resolves to kidnap Mr. Stockley in order to steal the keys to the headquarters and interrogate the code to Troop Grid out of him. Since Jake has nothing to do now, he's available to take notice of this and investigate deeper to realize Gus has escaped. He gathers Felix and Hayley back together to stop Gus. Meanwhile, Stockley refuses to give up the code, so he's dispatched, and Gus instructs Fredo to hack into the system himself. The troop break into headquarters themselves, which is a wild thing to be possible for anyone to do, to a secret facility that holds dangerous monsters. They discover that Gus hid their weapons from them, leaving them to face him and the Locked with some improvised ones instead. Fredo successfully hacks into Troop Grid and shuts down communications among all troop organizations. Felix knocks out the Locked, but they quickly find themselves at the business end of a blaster. Stockley returns as the reports of his death were greatly exaggerated, but before he can snark Gus, Fredo stuns him with the blaster. Fredo's hack finishes developing, releasing all monsters all over the world from captivity. Gus gloats that he's able to control the monsters, only for his device to jam, sending out a signal that aggravates the monsters. This causes the capsule of dimension mites to fall and shatter, tearing open an unstable portal into the monster dimension. Fredo, astonished by the pretty lights, walks right through the fucking portal. We'll get there. Jake grabs Gus before Gus gets sucked through, and the rest of the troop anchors Jake. Jake tries to convince Gus that they'll keep him safe, but Gus is sure they'll revert him back to his old self. So he lets go of Jake and allows himself to get sucked through the portal, confident that he will have the same leverage over the monsters there that he did before. His fate is left ambiguous as the sounds of his fucking screams reverberate through the badly damaged Lakewood troop headquarters once the portal closes. The troop celebrates being back in action by collecting some weapons and heading off to recapture the monsters Gus released. And so that's the Gus trilogy, an interesting angle for the series to take, building a recurring antagonist around this specific archetype, and I remember being fondly excited for this in particular. That season finale actually had some interesting callbacks to previous episodes that I haven't covered yet, and it was satisfying now to see such a character-driven episode that feels like a nice culmination of a lot of interpersonal arcs that the troupe went through. It easily places these episodes as some of the quintessential episodes of the series. Oh, also, I don't fucking like the way it handles mental illness and alternative mental orders. At the beginning of this video, my glasses regarding children's programming from this time were admittedly rose-tinted, but it would be a failure to act as if this undiscovered gem from my childhood was without its more explicit flaws. This treatment of Fredo as a constant punchline was funny enough to put on at noon on a Saturday in 2010, and they were perfectly fine with punishing this character who was the victim of an actually evil character and was incapable of understanding the scope of the negative consequences to his actions. And it wasn't the only episode to feature some particularly egregious problematic tropes that Nickelodeon rarely shied away from dipping its Dan Schneider toes into at the time. For that, we look earlier in the season at Pajama Game of Death. So in this episode, the troupe fights a Vespinox, a big wasp monster, only to discover it laid eggs, which is bad since Vespinox larvae burrow inside a human host and kill them at the end of their metamorphoses. Hayley leaves the cleanup to Jake and Felix so she can make it to cheerleading practice, but she fails to impress the head cheerleader, Roxanne, and even drops her on her face during a pyramid routine. Roxanne ends up being the secret human host that the troupe has to save in the end. In order to make it up to her and get in good with the rest of the cheerleading squad, Hayley invites them to a sleepover at her place. Back in HQ, the boys discover that one of the Vespinox eggs hatched, and after some more investigation, they deduce that the larva must have infected one of the cheerleaders. Oh no, Jake! One of the cheerleaders has a monster inside of her, and they're currently all cooped up at the third Monster Hunter's home for a girls-only sleepover. However shall we solve this problem? Here's a fun fact. As soon as I reached this point of the episode, I paused and went to quiz my friends on what wild fucking Nickelodeon trope I just stumbled on based off of that premise. And one of them suggested that they were window hopping. I told them what actually happened, but then 10 minutes later, Jane and Felix got kicked out of the sleepover, and get this, I had to go back and tell them that they were also fucking right. Look at this shit.
Breakin'. We have what it takes to be international jewel thieves. What decade are you from?
Does it help that there's also a significant plot point where the Vespinox host can be sussed out by finding someone demonstrating symptoms that parallel problematic stereotypes of teenage girls? Because I know it doesn't. Speaking of sus, there's an Among Us episode.
The Vercingetorix is a shapeshifter. It puts its victim in a cocoon and assumes the victim's shape. One of you is in that cocoon. One of you is the monster.
When the Vercingetorix is sus?
Excuse me, is that a poisonous snake?
Also, Vercingetorix was like a guy that existed. I have no clue why they named this monster after him. Why they changed the pronunciation. Why any of this is
Is that the poisonous snake?
What? Where? Oh! Oh! Oh no. This is bad. This is very bad. It's such a distinct stickiness that I don't much care for. people get gooed on a lot in this show.
You alright?
Watch this. My mother gave me these.
There's, like, so much goo.
Here it comes!
You know, I really gotta go, sorry. I'm fine.
Her brain's melting.
Did someone say something about a kiss?
No, like, seriously? There's so much goo.
It has been years since anyone has brought down a 5 most.
I've never won an award. Now we've really got to get that Griffin.
If either of you think about turning around, you'll be evaporated.
If there's a show on Nickelodeon where people get slimed as often as this, then I don't know. Oh! Right, yeah, no, I get it. That makes sense. Yeah. Did not consider that one much. Yeah. That is a particularly specific type of gloopiness. Do you ever think about death? Like, really think about it?
So, regarding that part there, about the Vercingetorix cocooning its victim and taking its shape, what I didn't include was that it returns to the cocoon later to consume the victim. This thing ate a baby. It ate a baby! This is never addressed. No, this is a show about dangerous monsters terrorizing the suburbs and monster hunters secretly taking them down. Surely there are bound to be some casualties, right? And yeah, we've covered a couple already, including some times where they've skirted the line around the consequence of death. But generally speaking, if there is a death, it's never really dwelled on, sometimes to quite comedic lengths. When Jake knocks the head off of Mrs. Burker's statue in the first episode, well before learning that duct tape would fix it, you would think that he would feel devastated at the fact that he seems to have just accidentally taken a human life, but no, none of that. When the Vampsters completely eat an administrator in the cold open of their episode, it's punctuated by a moment where one of them pulls a scrap of clothing out of his swollen hamster cheeks. I mean, listen to the troop's reactions to Gus's terrified, painful screaming at the end of the season finale.
I'm sure he'll be fine.
Yeah.
That would make it seem like death is kind of just a punchline in this show, right? Well, counterpoint. I think about this more often than I think about plane crashes and shark attacks combined. And it's a fucking Dungeons and Dragons Jello shot. I'm losing my fucking mind.
Human essence! I figured it out! It feeds on intense emotions such as a joyous laughter, wrenching sorrow, blinding rage.
Oh, fucking does it? This dude didn't just fucking die, he ceased to exist. This motherfucker literally ate his fucking soul.
Longest 12 weeks of my life. I'll go straight to integer week. You see what happened?
Oh, is he not cute? Is he not cute? Doesn't that just make you forget about how this thing fucking exploded a guy's atoms in less than 5 fucking seconds? So far, I've covered a lot of this show, dove into a lot of the larger overarching aspects and some more specific critiques and other little nuggets of content, but one thing I just cannot get enough of are the monsters. And I want to spend some time before moving on to just spotlight some monsters that were of note to me. Now first off, some of you folks may be familiar with iCarly.com, the companion website that Nickelodeon designed around the site shown on television. This place was a hub for clips of the characters performing for the web show, as well as extra content like blogs written from the perspective of the characters. What you may not know, and that I've hinted at before, is that this isn't the only time Nickelodeon attempted something like this, and you could actually access troopgrid.com back in the day to get a much more immersive troop experience. Whenever you would enter the website, you would be cleared for access as if you were part of the troop yourself, and you could access information on troop technology and play games stylized as monster hunting missions. My favorite of these was a full story-based adventure where you had to find an abandoned troop headquarters in order to find a weapon to defeat a gigantic behemoth that attacks once every 50 years. It was styled like a linear escape room of sorts, and I had a lot of fun playing it back when I could. There was also a Monster Factory, TM, which was the subject of a fun contest held by the showrunners, where the best monster design created by a fan would get a cameo on the show. That's where we meet the one-horned Diablo. It has like 7 mouths, and the main one is a butthole with teeth. That's a funny trick to play on God. This website also had profiles on all the monsters seen in the show, as well as a few bonus monsters that were never adapted, such as this one, Pukwudgie. There was also a function on this website called Field Notes, where you would be able to leave comments for other troop members to see. What say you, Cory Bory? Yo mama! You'll love to see it. Now, one episode that really resonated with me as a kid was called Forest Grump. In it, the student council decides to organize a tranquility garden as a memorial for the shop teacher who died in a skydiving accident. They don't go into detail about this, but I personally think that this is one of very few moments in the series where a death is not actually associated with a monster attack, because I feel like skydiving accident is just way too specific a cover-up for a monster attack. Now, unfortunately, the construction of this tranquility garden would require the felling of a section of the woods near the school, and new student Laurel is upset. Jake elects to help her get acclimated to the school better to cheer her up, and they start dating. Meanwhile, mysteriously, members of the student council are going missing, and as Hayley finds out later, they have been turned into trees in those woods where the garden is to be made. Yes, teenagers get turned into trees by a mysterious monster. It's just like the Sunderman movie, but better. Don't ask me by what margin, it's better. Anyway, Laurel vexes Jake with her strange mannerisms until Hayley catches on that she's a dryad, a tree monster that can take a human form. Feeling betrayed by Jake and still out to protect her woods, she escapes and waits for an opportunity to attack the student council president. Once she attacks, Felix gets the president away to safety, and Laurel incapacitates Hayley, leaving Jake the only one left to stop her. For one of the rare times in the series, Jake elects not to blast his way out of the problem and talks down Laurel, promising that in return for their safety, he'll have the student council turn the area into a tranquility grove rather than a tranquility garden, saving the trees. Laurel agrees on the condition that Jake visits her tree whenever he can, and he emphatically agrees. They end up saying their goodbyes, and she turns into a tree as they share a kiss. In the season finale I discussed in detail earlier, they actually revealed that Jake kept this promise with Laurel, which is just really sweet. And guys, seriously, this shit was my fucking Twilight Saga, okay? I walked away from this episode actively jealous that Jake got a cute tree girlfriend. I rewatched this episode recently for this review, and then went to work, and I realized while bagging groceries that it re-sparked all the daydreams I had as a kid. I don't even know if I have anything to add except the personal experience of hoping the troop was real, with a significant reasoning being that I would possibly get to have something like this happen to me. So like, I guess what I'm saying is, I'm gonna hold out hope. And, if any cute tree monsters see this video, hit me up. I'll turn the giving tree. One more time. Hold on. I'll turn the giving tree. I'll turn the giving tree into the receiving tree, if you know what I mean. Ra-cha-cha. That's the worst. That's the worst thing I've ever said. So there's one monster I really wanted to point out because I thought it was funny. In the episode Hayley and Felix on the Side, the troop battles a two-headed Xylork, which secretes a specific neurotoxin that coats its claws. Unfortunately, this monster scratches both Hayley and Felix, which gives them limited time to live unless an antidote is administered. However, that's only one effect of the neurotoxin. The other effect is that if you were scratched by this monster, it would make you dangerously into vor.
You are dinner. Don't you get it?
He's dinner. I'm dessert. Don't tell him much more delicious.
Are not. He's gonna eat me first.
Oh, of course, dummy, you're dinner.
I wish there was a better way to explain that. But if I'm being honest, no, I don't. So I also wanted to take some quick time to look at the Wraith, which is basically like Pennywise if he had lobsters for feet and beehives for hands. No, literally. So this monster creates a vapor that places you in a hypnotic REM state, paralyzed by the visions of your greatest fear. In Hayley's case, it's being overwhelmed by hundreds of overdue assignments. For Felix, his greatest fear is the existential dread of the limitations of the human mind, and the dawning horror of the end of all things, the inevitable heat death, all so far out of reach from even the moment that his psychological condition wavers, and he's left the breathing visage of former greatness as all of his thoughts and memories become fleeting instances, destroyed the moment they are conceived. Just kidding, it's the weird fucking clown. Finally, the Wraith turns its attention towards Jake, who has a terrible vision of himself being unable to save his friends, and they look upon him with fear and disappointment as they're attacked by pretty much a Windows screensaver. This leaves everyone paralyzed until Jake conjures enough strength to break free of this terrible spell and pull out his last-ditch weapon, defeating the spooky jellyfish Grim Reaper monster with funny fart noise.
Uh-oh.
Now, some of you may have noticed a strange variation in these monsters, with most holding a more animalistic quality about them, and others seeming to have a human level of self-awareness. And this is something that does perplex me. Why are there some monsters that can present themselves as humans, or simply are human in appearance, while most other monsters are just strange magical cryptids? It's one of those world-building rules that in this case delivers a large amount of interesting possibilities for plot drama without really making a ton of sense in and of itself. However, the sheer perplexity you might have regarding some of these monsters' designs and capabilities pale in comparison to the single most preposterous monster this show had to offer. You clicked on this video because you expected to learn about Nickelodeon's forgotten masterpiece. And if you've been unimpressed up to this point, allow the absolute perfection of this show to unfurl itself before you. Dr. Cranius, a mad scientist, evil genius, sponge, who went to Harvard, voiced by Kelsey motherfucking Grammer.
Last time I was in troop custody was in Saint-Tropez. Beautiful girls in Saint-Tropez. I remember this one redhead. Well, let's just say, evil isn't my only weakness.
Yeah, that's right. A sponge akin to Sideshow Bob. A SpongeBob, if you will, please don't. No longer shall we argue whether the Frasier reboot needed Kelsey Grammer, or if Kelsey Grammer really needed that Frasier reboot. So Dr. Cranius is being transferred to a high-security facility that is being built, and the Lakewood troop is enlisted to guard him until then. During this time, he manipulates them into doing small things that would help him in his master plan to escape. He gets Jake to trust him by giving him tips to make girls want him more that seem to work. For this, Jake ends up getting him a poster board of Harvard to improve his view at his request, and later is convinced to set up a better guarding system using a series of mirrors so that he can see him from anywhere in HQ. Felix, meanwhile, is convinced to set up a better guarding system himself using lasers, and Cranius plays favorites to stew drama within the troop and strain their teamwork. Hayley confides with Cranius that she had to reschedule the cheerleading squad's car wash fundraiser when she found out it conflicted with the AV clubs, and Cranius convinces her to change it back and challenge the AV club in order to strengthen her reputation with the cheerleading squad. All the while, Dr. Cranius sends Mr. Stockley on a wild goose chase to find some secret plan for him to escape, when in reality it's a diversion to get him out of the way. Finally, Dr. Cranius sets his plan in motion, having Felix activate his laser system, which, combined with Jake's mirror system, traps them in HQ while Dr. Cranius uses the Harvard poster as a ramp to escape. He makes his way to the car wash and hides himself among the sponges there, eventually using the chaos of the combative cheerleaders and AV geeks to launch himself to the end of the parking lot. It's there that he convenes with his minion, Cinnamon.
I was afraid that in the confusion you might miss me.
How could I miss you, Gunther? You're the handsomest sponge here.
Let's not talk about it. He almost manages to get away, only for a girl Jake was flirting with to pull in front of them, looking for revenge after Jake flirted with another girl at the same time, as per Cranius' suggestion. This one cog in Cranius' plan ironically slows them down just enough for the troop to catch up and recapture him, locking him away in a comically secured containment cell. Kelsey Grammer is never heard from again, he dies in there. I think that's a good place to leave off discussion of Season 1. I think I've made my case well enough for having labeled this a masterpiece of sorts, but I have yet to properly address the alluded premise this video exists under. This show was so great, so why don't you remember it? Well, I think there's a few answers for that. For one, kids around this era just didn't have the same level of excitement for action-adventure shows as much as previous generations may have. Maybe this show would have been absolutely ballin' in the 90s, but when you try to stack it up to Nick's contemporary powerhouse sitcoms, those were just much more effective at holding a kid's attention. I Think They Kissed aired out to a 7.6 million viewership. As soon as that episode ended and the troop premiered for the first time ever, 4 million of those viewers left, giving the show a 3.5 million viewership on its premiere. And maybe it has to do with marketing. After all, Nick did put a lot more advertising behind the anticipation for the new season of iCarly than they put for this brand new show. In fact, I remember going to kids I went to elementary school with and asking them back in 2009 when this show was being released if they watched it. And they told me that they hadn't even heard of it. So it seems the reason you don't remember this show is simply that you didn't know it existed in the first place. That makes sense, yes. So barely anyone watched the show in its time. What happened to it then? And that's where things get a bit fun for me. You see, I absolutely adored the first 26 episodes of the show and readily anticipated more of it to come. And I readily anticipated it. And I readily anticipated it. The Season 1 finale came out on August 21st, 2010. Several months earlier, perhaps at a time when the network was a bit more hopeful about the show's ratings, on March 12, 2010, they renewed the series for a second season. When the time actually came for them to start airing the second season, they delayed it several times, finally beginning premiere on June 5th, 2011. They produced 14 episodes for this season, and spent the summer airing an episode a week until August 6th of that year, where they aired the 7th episode and then shelved the fucking series. They were apparently so fucking embarrassed by viewer turnout that they took half the episodes they made and just put them in a vault where they would stay until October 29th and 30th, 2012, where they aired 4 of the episodes on their smaller channel, Nicktoons, and then they just dumped the last 3 there over the course of motherfucking May 6th, 7th, and 8th of the year of our Lord 2013. All the while, since August of 2011, when they first decided the show wasn't worth saving, those 7 episodes were also floating on iTunes for $3 each. But don't worry, $2 if you don't want to splurge on high definition. I'm not entirely sure how they shit the bed so hard in the management of their own show that it took 2.5 years to go from one season finale to the next, as if they weren't absolutely rolling in enough softcore foot porn money to find a better solution. You know it's terrible when you have die-hard fans of the show like me, who were left absolutely puzzled by the fact that Season 2 ever even happened. I loved season 1, and I had a lot of fun returning to it. But folks, it's time now to watch something I've never seen before. Of the one half of this show I treated as a religious experience in my childhood, there's this confounding mystery looming over my head about the other half of the show, simply existing in the peripheral of this show's troubled history, begging for me to finally tear open the veil. On one hand, I start to understand J.J. Abrams and his infamous mystery box, which he refused to ever open and ruin the mystery forever. Perhaps there are some things that are meant to evade me. Perhaps I'm truly not meant to ever watch season 2 of this show. On the other hand, J.J. Abrams is full of shit. This is The Troop Season 2, everyone. So, the season premiere was titled The Triangle, and before I get too deep into it, I figure I need to clarify one quick thing I didn't see as all that important throughout season 1. I made one passing mention about how Jake had a crush on Hayley growing up, and that's somewhat relevant to the program. In a few episodes like Forest Grump and Batteries Not Included, Hayley and Jake find themselves at odds over girls that Jake is dating or wants to date, implying Hayley to be secretly jealous. In the season 1 episode Speed, this becomes particularly notable when an Eris fairy, a love-centric fairy with super speed, played by special guest star Victoria Justice, starts manipulating events on Valentine's Day to get couples to argue and split up. Eventually, to catch her, Felix hatches a plan to use a motion-activated freeze ray, using Jake and Hayley acting as if they were dating as bait. During this time, they spill their true feelings for each other, but ultimately write it off as them just playing it up to catch the Eris fairy. At the time, I thought it was a cute ship, a neat will they, won't they thing that didn't stick with me all that much because it was never resolved by the end of season 1. Season 2 plays around with this plot thread a bit more. So the Triangle begins with the Lakewood troop back in action on another hunt. This one at a chemical factory, where they're looking for an ice ghoul. Felix gets incapacitated when he slips on some chemicals, and Hayley goes to tend to him. That's when the ice ghoul emerges, and Jake attempts to hold it off, resulting in it freezing him in a block of ice. Hayley immediately leaps to Jake's aid, melting the ice ghoul and thawing Jake out, clearly distressed by the danger he was in and being very tender with him, something Felix gleefully takes note of. Later, Felix tries to convince Jake to make a move and ask Hayley out, and Jake resolves himself to doing so. Suddenly, a man enters to deliver a holographic message to Felix in the form of what appears to be a Bakugan. Turns out, Felix is being considered for entry into the Developmental Organization for Remarkable Kids, DORK for short, headed by Dr. Nairobi. Felix visits for the tour and is as impressed with the institution as they are with him, leaving him with a dilemma where he must choose this relocation of schools or stay with the troop. Meanwhile, Hayley plays the welcoming committee to a new girl at the school, Cadence Nash, played by Molly's Zhao, a badass punk who woke up and is making that everyone's problem. Jake finally makes a move to ask out Hayley, only for Cadence to butt in between them and coyly accept Jake's question as if it were directed at her, refusing to accept it as a mistake when Hayley suggests that to be the case, with Jake feeling too awkward and unsure of the situation to turn Cadence down himself. It's actually pretty clever, the title of The Triangle. For one, it plays with the logo of both the show and the troop as an agency in the show, which is an offshoot of the Penrose Triangle, a two-dimensional image depicting proportions that suggest the structure of a triangular three-dimensional shape that would be impossible in actual three-dimensional space, described by mathematician Sir Roger Penrose as impossibility in its purest form. It also refers to the love triangle formed where Jake has to choose between Hayley and Cadence, as well as the similarly structured dilemma Felix is confronted with. Ultimately, Felix decides that he would be happier at Dork, much to the chagrin of Mr. Stockley, and begins his experience there while Jake goes on his date with Cadence. Cadence ends up impressing Jake with her tomboyish charm, thoroughly beating Jake at foosball, as well as demonstrating a rich vein of knowledge about comic books. It's kind of like a soft reboot of the plot hook that was left ambiguously open regarding Jake's and Brittany's relationship at the end of Do the Worm, except Cadence eats 3 entire fucking pizzas, which is concerning. At the DORK, Felix tracks down a girl he has a crush on, Radhika, to a side room, only to find her strapped to a table by brain-eating gorbs. Dr. Nairobi arrives to reveal himself as the mastermind behind this, developing the dork as a facility to farm large brains to feast upon. Felix narrowly evades capture long enough to call Jake and Hayley over, who, as Jake discovers, are at the same diner because Hayley is monitoring his date. They have a brief argument over this before going to help Felix, and Cadence follows them to the DORK out of confusion and anger over Jake bailing on his date to hang out with Hayley. Hayley freezes her, and they go to save Felix and Radhika from the Gorbs, which are basically Mars attacks, from the big weird brain heads to the axe sounds to the fact that their weakness is ultimately discovered to be music that makes their heads explode. In the wake of defeating the Gorbs, Radhika is grateful for Felix's heroism, and Hayley ultimately decides to let Jake finish his date with Cadence in peace, just happy at the fact that he's happy. The episode ends with a shot of Jake and Cadence walking away as Felix and Hayley watch on. Cadence's shadow has a tail. Jake got another cute monster girlfriend and I'm still fucking single! So that was The Triangle, the first episode of Season 2. And I'll tell ya, this is a completely different show. For one, the action is structured much differently. While in Season 1, everything was much more Ghostbusters, point the blaster at the thing and shoot, the action we saw here was much more focused on these small bursts of gymnastic stunts and slow-mo footage like a kung fu movie. Also, everything looks brighter and more saturated to kind of fit in with a new aesthetic they're really pushing for. The lighting and color correction in most of Season 1 was much more baseline and natural, contributing somewhat to the suburban horror vibe they pushed for when they weren't telling jokes. Now, well, I'll just call it like I see it. It looks like a comic book. The editing even evokes some of that Ang Lee's The Hulk imagery of adapting a comic book aesthetic onto television. There's even been a complete overhaul on how the sets get designed. In Season 1, the troop headquarters had this sleek military base kind of sci-fi look to it, but now it's been redesigned with this retro 50s sci-fi look. The monsters also seem to have been given a new design focus, shifting from designs based around mythology and animals to these more cartoonish creatures. Even the opening title sequence has changed from a cinematic sequence showcasing the troop going about their day and running into some troubles over their dealings as troop members, as well as battling an escaped monster in Troop HQ all over an instrumental track, to this new version showcasing a very deliberate comic book edit to clips from the show with a new pop theme song with lyrics and everything. I'm not saying that I don't like this new show, it's just that it's hard now to fully consider this a proper follow-up to the show I grew so attached to as a child. And I assume this to be just another in the long line of errors Nickelodeon made with handling the show that directly contributed to its downfall. I struggle to think of a show that ever changed its identity to this degree between seasons, let alone one that would ever go on to stand the test of time and be recognizable to anyone. Because, frankly, this is barely recognizable as the troop, even to me. Let's move on to the second episode, The Monster Within, to follow up on some plot threads teased in the previous. The episode begins with a small, nearly harmless insectoid monster flying around near Lakewood High, identified by on-screen text as a 7-winged Kritlak, which is weird because I do count only 2 wings. The same on-screen text then identifies Felix Garcia as well as a bully he runs into, who then challenges Felix to a fight. As the bully offers Felix to throw the first punch, an unidentified blue humanoid monster eagerly tracks the movement of the Kritlak. The monster moves at an unimaginably fast speed to catch the bug, pummeling the bully in the meantime and sending him soaring across the schoolyard, making it look like Felix's punch did that, and Felix is treated as a hero. He starts standing up to more bullies, and even gets invited to the VIP table at lunch. This is a cartoon. It's revealed in dialogue that Jake and Cadence aren't necessarily an official couple at this point, despite going on a few dates. Hayley ends up encountering her later while setting up for a fundraiser bake sale, confronting her for her general attitude as she steals a cookie from the table. They engage in a food fight stunt show that lands them both in detention, where they end up finding a mutual respect for each other upon bonding over their strength and the assumptions people place on them. Cadence leaves detention in a desperate, hurried state over a spurt of hunger pangs, hiding out of sight from anyone else as she transforms into the monster from earlier that almost certainly lives in a blue house with a blue little window and a blue Corvette, and everything is blue for her and herself and everybody around because she ain't got nobody to listen. The on-screen text returns to identify her as half-human, half-blood thrasher. During a hunt, the troop ends up discovering that something is catching monsters around town for food, and when Felix later looks at the security camera footage of the fight at the beginning of the episode, he realizes the blood thrasher caught on camera must be responsible. Jake and Hayley take a small monster into a field to serve as bait to lure the blood thrasher out, and Cadence, in blood thrasher form, steals the monster and yeets Jake hundreds of yards away. Hayley, who had been building suspicions upon observing Cadence's eating patterns and claw marks she dug into a table at the diner, hesitates blasting the monster, and likewise Cadence backs off upon recognizing Hayley. Later, Hayley follows Cadence into an alley, catching her in the act of eating a monster, and they have an intense standoff over the secrets they've kept from each other that directly make them dangerous to each other, Cadence being half monster and Hayley being a monster hunter. Cadence transforms and attacks, leaving Hayley to call Jake and Felix for backup. The two of them end up trapped inside a dumpster before Hayley gets the upper hand, which she uses to allow Cadence to escape and fake the blood thrasher's disintegration to the other two. The episode ends with Hayley and Cadence giving a knowing nod to each other at school the next day, and this is the ship that I care the most about. Jake already has a dryad girlfriend, and the absolute tension between Hayley and Cadence just screams enemies turned friends, turned lovers. Do it, Nickelodeon, no balls. Something really interesting to me is how they've been treating Felix's character in these last 2 episodes. Suddenly he went from the comically unpopular nerd who couldn't even build a robot that wants to be friends with him, to a complete ladies' man being lauded for his technological achievements, managing to legitimately stand up for himself and others against bullies, and get accepted into popular cliques, all without any real subversion of this respect and adoration he's accruing by the end of the episodes. It's a peculiar new angle that I'm interested in seeing them explore further. So episode 3, It's All in the Game, opens with Hayley and Jake staking out a monster-related disturbance when a limousine arrives to drop off Kirby, the replacement troop member taking Felix's place. What? So this was an aspect of the second season I was somewhat aware of going in, but didn't actually know the full context of until now, only to learn that the full context is actually a complete lack of context. Around this time, David Del Rio was brought into other acting projects, stepping down from his role as Felix Garcia, making the first 2 episodes of the season his final 2 in the entire series. As a result, the showrunners wrote him out of the series by promoting him to a full position at Troop International, leaving a vacant spot at the Lakewood Troop, which is meant to have 3 members. That's where Kirby Bancroft Cadworth III comes in, played by Matt Shively. One thing they seemed to want to avoid with this situation was the introduction of a troop member who would be completely new to troop happenings, which would lead to a repeat of Jake's main arc in Season 1. Instead, Kirby is a transfer from an Oklahoma division of the troop, characterized by the big shoes he has to fill. As we establish in this introductory scene, Kirby is a big fan of Felix's work inventing new tools and weapons for the troop, and he strives to accomplish similar feats. Unfortunately, nothing he invents works as intended, establishing a new source of conflicts for the troop to handle, as well as for Kirby himself to overcome over his short run in the series. So the A-plot of this episode kinda just runs its course. The troop finds that a group of hypnotized kids have congregated to a spot where a portal to the monster world opens, sending through a hungry kaiju. After defeating the kaiju, they determine the source of the hypnosis to be linked to the release of a video game, so Jake and Kirby go to a gaming convention to investigate. While there, another portal opens and sends kaiju over to attempt to feast on hypnotized gamers, which Jake and Kirby scare off. Declan Patrick, the developer of the video game in question, Horror Tracker 4, is impressed by their special effects show and invites them to meet with him in private later. While they meet him in a green-screened office like something out of epic rap battles, he gives them special gold editions of the game and insists that they play through level 17. They notice as he walks away that he has a brain leech attached to his head, which they attempt to shoot off, only for Kirby's special blaster to fail, and Declan escapes. Later, Jake plays through the game and beats level 17, becoming hypnotized himself. Kirby calls Hayley to help him follow Jake, to which it's probably worth mentioning what Hayley's been up to for most of the episode. So, earlier in the episode, Hayley stands up to a bully on behalf of Babushka, a foreign exchange student from a fictional Eastern Bloc country, and for this, Babushka believes she owes Hayley a debt of gratitude. This entire plot is pretty racist. Babushka ends up giving Hayley clothes she made herself, which is a potato sack and a potato necklace, with a chicken to wear as a crown. She makes a whole thing out of kissing Hayley's feet. She is mentioned keeping a pig and a baby llama in her locker. She undergoes a skincare routine of pouring boiled noodles on her head. She calls it noodling. She responds to a staged interaction between Hayley and the bully where he drags Hayley away by her feet as if it were a marriage proposal. This is all played for laughs, as if there are any laughs to give at tired stereotyping. This plot is ultimately resolved, I shit you not, with the phrase, "If you want to be an American, you have to do things the way Americans do." So, Hayley and Kirby arrive where more hypnotized kids, including Jake, have arrived to feed themselves to some kaiju. But when the two of them start blasting the kaiju, Declan arrives to stop them, giving Kirby the opportunity to save the day by blasting the mind leech off of Declan's head, killing the monster, and snapping everyone out of the hypnosis. This episode really feels like the beginning of the end for the troop. Not only did Nick fail to market this show, not only did they shit the bed at scheduling its release, not only did they have the show go through an entire identity crisis between seasons, but they wrote out one of the leads and replaced him with a brand new character with absolutely zero warning after 2 episodes. I recognize this situation as likely being a pretty patchwork reworking of Felix's character after an abrupt exit on David Del Rio's part, since Kirby serves much of the same function to the team dynamic as Felix did, but to not even spend some time transitioning between characters just feels like the show is gasping for air and floundering as things fall apart outside of its own control. So a couple episodes later, we start to develop the main plot a bit further. In Oh Brother, Jake and Cadence are on another date when Jake is pulled away by updates on his portable troop grid about a blood thrasher in the area. Cadence sees this other blood thrasher and is chased down by it, only to realize that it's her brother, Chino Nash. He taunts her for going human on him while she tries to convince him to skip town and not eat her friends. Chino explains that her refusal to eat humans is what's starving her, and he disappears before the troop returns. Hayley confronts her when she learns that they were on a date, trying to convince her to tell Jake that she's half monster on her own terms before Hayley has to do it herself. There's some more back and forth as Cadence struggles to find a good time to tell Jake her secret, while also trying to keep Chino a secret from the troop, as well as keep him from eating people, culminating in a moment where Chino eats a security guard and Hayley comes across his remains. She scans the scene and the analysis comes back positive for Blood Thrasher. She confronts Cadence during another date, revealing the secret to Jake, and Cadence tells them about her brother, who's much more dangerous than her. The two of them go to capture Chino, at first offering him to surrender himself, but when he makes a move to attack, Jake stuns him with a blaster. Cadence witnesses this and, thinking they killed Chino, vows revenge. Hayley and Jake bring Chino to Troop HQ in a disguised transport unit, and Cadence follows them, breaking in through the elevator. Again, how can anyone break into the troop? This shit should be Fort fucking Knox. Cadence threatens to kill Jake as retribution, and, unable to pull the trigger on her, Jake resorts to popping open a unit of dimension mites, which suck Cadence through a portal into the monster world, along with a device Jake held on his utility belt. That main plot helps to establish where the next episode goes as a direct follow-up, but it probably left you wondering what Kirby must have been up to throughout the episode. Right. Well, he got himself stuck in a time machine he was attempting to build, so until they were able to get someone to cut him out, another troop member had to be introduced temporarily to keep up with the requirement of 3 troop members at any given division. So, that thing I said earlier about the showrunners seeming to not want to introduce another person unfamiliar with the goings-on of the troop, I guess exceptions were to be made for 2-episode arcs where such persons could be introduced as comic relief. This means that the next most capable person to join the troop, based off the aptitude test from the pilot, gets a quick run at being a troop member, and that person is Etienne. So, throughout this episode, Etienne fails to understand the point of a secret organization being kept secret, and generally causes a ruckus of things, while also flirting with a clearly non-reciprocating Hayley an obnoxious amount. And when compared to the rather dramatic character-driven arcs this episode otherwise provides, it creates a weird kind of tonal whiplash that goes beyond the awkward tonal discrepancies this show has had to offer up to this point. I also have known Kirby for 2 fucking episodes. This season has been flip-flopping through troop members like no one's business. Of the 7 episodes of this season that actually aired on Nickelodeon, 2 have had Felix, 2 have had Etienne, and 3 have had Kirby. And if that doesn't make the show feel unsure of itself, I don't know what does. So, Through the Looking Glass follows up on the climax of Oh Brother, where they reveal that the device that Cadence pulled through the portal, Jake's portable troop grid, operates on a specific frequency that, itself, opens a portal to the monster world. A portal that does not close, unlike the normal ones that stay open for about a minute. This portal is discovered and blocked off from the public, only for some passersby to mistake the tent for a performing location of a hit indie rock band, leaving Etienne to have to entertain the spectators while the issue is handled. Jake volunteers to enter the portal into the monster world to collect the troop grid and bring it back through, in spite of the danger he would be in as a human. He goes through and searches for the device, only to be attacked by monsters in the process. He's saved by Cadence, who takes him to her home in the monster world, where she grew attached to human cultures with the items that have ended up falling into the monster world over the years. She returns the device to Jake and sends him away, ashamed that she hadn't been able to control her monster side around him before. However, before he could leave to get back to the portal, his human scent attracts a gigantic monster that pulls him out and away from the house. Cadence chases the claw that took Jake, dislodging it and once again saving him, only for them to look upon the home as it's destroyed by several more of those clawed appendages in search of the human. Jake realizes that the portable troop grid was broken in the attack, at which point the portal begins to close, trapping Jake in the monster world. In a moment of panic, Hayley jumps through the portal herself to attempt to find and protect Jake. Jake, Cadence, and Hayley all reconvene in the monster world and are chased by a bunch of the fuckers while Mr. Stockley organizes a plot with Troop International to have Dimension-Mite portals be opened at every troop location in hopes that one just so happens to open near Jake and Hayley to allow them to return. One of these portals appears on the other side of the barrage of monsters that have cornered the gang at a wall of rocks, so Cadence sacrifices herself by drawing the monster's attentions toward her, giving the other two a straight shot to the portal. After receiving a thorough beating by these monsters, Cadence ends up close enough for Jake and Hayley to save her at the last minute, pulling her through a portal that takes them to a Hawaiian division of the troop. The episode ends with the celebration of a mission success and the snarking of Etienne. Something very interesting to me here is that they did absolutely nothing to so much as hint at the fate of Gus and Fredo after both of them ended up in the monster world at the end of the season 1 finale. The screaming and general danger of this dimension would normally lead one to assume that they were pretty quickly killed by this world's monsters, but some sources claim that there were plans to bring Gus back as the main antagonist in season 3 had that been produced. Despite this, there's not so much as an Easter egg pointing me toward a potential return of Gus here in the episode where they actually go into the monster world. That leads me to assume that this must be an establishment of the monster world to further explore as part of a Gus-centric plot in season 3, or there was just a conscious decision made to keep Gus out of season 2 so that the main arc of the season could be focused on Cadence's relationship with the troop without muddying itself in the goings-on of the surrounding seasons. This resolution does leave the lack of Gus's presence in the episode pretty palpable, however, when considering the fact that season 3 never came into fruition. Without that to confirm Gus's survival in the monster world, this episode almost serves as a sort of confirmation to the contrary. For all intents and purposes, Gus fucking died. And he fucking died in tremendous fear and pain. But such is life, ain't it? Now, watching the rest of this season left me missing Felix a bit, since Kirby's entrance serves as essentially the last time his name is so much as uttered in the series, which is a preposterously abrupt change that makes Felix feel essentially dead to the writers. Except, of course, for, well, it's complicated. You see, not only was season 2 kind of a mess in execution, it was also released out of production order. For example, the 4th episode of the season, Mirrors, came out before Oh Brother, where the rest of the troop learns that Cadence is half monster. However, during this episode, Kirby makes an offhand mention of Cadence's monster side, and no one bats an eye. But the most egregious error was the movement of the episodes Eris Returns and Doomhound to the back half of the season, since they chronologically exist in the transition between Felix's move to Troop International and Kirby's arrival at the beginning of It's All in the Game. And with one of those episodes in particular comes the death rattle of Felix Garcia's character. I'll clarify once again that David Del Rio does not appear in the series again after The Monster Within, but his presence resonates into the episode Eris Returns. It really feels like a Felix episode, with minor rewrites that make replacing him with a different character work barely enough. Funny enough, the exact same thing can be said about the Eris Ferry. In Speed, Felix ends up hitting it off with Victoria Justice's Eris Fairy by helping her return to the monster world to get back with her boyfriend. When the Eris titularly returns, it is Daniela Monet, portraying Cecilia, the sister of Victoria Justice's Eris Fairy, which is, of course, funny because she plays Victoria Justice's sister in Victorious. Daniela Monet's career on Nickelodeon is kind of an interesting anomaly. She seemed to be the go-to actress when it came to recasting characters, whether it be because the original actress didn't want to return, such as with Jeanette McCurdy playing Bertha in Fred the Movie, or when a character is changed from the original form in such a way that makes recasting them kind of necessary, such as when they aged up Tootie and made her live action in the movie Grow Up Timmy Turner. So Cecilia ends up building a relationship with Etienne after assuming him to be the Felix her sister told her about. And Etienne just kind of plays it off to get a date to the Valentine's dance. Throughout the episode, Cecilia's vengeful and obsessive boyfriend, Todd the Vrog, enters the human world to find her and destroy whoever took her from him, which culminates in a sequence where Cecilia opens a portal into the monster world and tackles Todd into it in order to protect Etienne, who Jake and Hayley decide to snark once they finish sharing a dance together. While Kirby can largely be analyzed as a surrogate for Felix and the role he served in the team, Etienne, being little more than a goober of a side character, was able to be molded into that position in several ways as well when Kirby didn't happen to be involved in the episode. The only real differences these two brought to the table were their own small quirks and oddities, doing little else than to serve merely as shells that the ghost of Felix inhabits, making this second season feel just that much less like the first season that I grew to know and love. All of this begs the question, if the Eris Fairy has the ability to create portals into the monster world on a whim, why didn't the first one do that when she was trapped in the human world and couldn't get back to her boyfriend? Now, I don't really hate Kirby as a character, I'm just annoyed that I didn't get enough time to get to know him and let him exist as more than just Felix's replacement. It's a dynamic that I struggle to fully accept. Similarly, Cadence, the other new character this season, struggles to find a significant foothold in the goings-on of the troupe, and this season suffers much more from issues involving B-plots that have very little to do with the monster hunting premise, almost always as a way to justify giving Cadence something to do as a main character who isn't part of the troupe, without digging for more drama about her half-monster side. Very often, we'll see the troupe going after a monster, and Cadence's role will more or less be chalked up to character who shows up every few scenes to give advice to or banter with another character. Mr. Stockley has interestingly had a bit of a glow-up character-wise by having plots focus less on him, essentially making him ground control, there to discuss game plans and deliver monster exposition to the kids. It seems like a characterization that fits him better than what most of Season 1 put him through. Now, I say I don't fully buy the group dynamic of Jake, Hayley, Kirby, and Cadence, but some of the final run of episodes from this season make an effort to work on team building, culminating in the team satisfyingly serving as a complete unit by the finale. Inklings of this really start to shine through in This Bird You Cannot Cage, where the destruction of the clock's Nixon and Nilsness initiates a beautiful light show, complete with bubbles, incidentally the perfect setting for the Lakewood High School prom, where Cadence pulls Jake, Hayley, and Kirby aside to share a slow dance all together. And I take it back, this is the ship I actually care the most about. But before we jump into the final episode, we reach Road Trip, where the season's laser focus on the mutual crushes that Jake and Hayley had for each other culminates. In this episode, they receive a distress call from the nearby Stillwater Troop and go to investigate, only to find themselves facing off against a previously undiscovered and highly dangerous fog monster that can phase shift into a snake-like creature that can swallow people whole and trap them in the fog. They attempt to freeze it to no avail, sending them scrambling into the Stillwater Troop's panic room, where they await their doom as the fog monster slowly beats down the door. Eventually, they have the idea to heat it up in order to dissipate it, turning on all the appliances in the panic room. When that doesn't seem to do the trick, and they appear to be about to die together, Jake and Hayley finally share a kiss. The body heat they release during this kiss increases the temperature of the room just enough to dissipate the fog monster, saving themselves and the Stillwater Troop. They return home, their relationship having developed just that much further, and all just in time for ice hassles. The Season 2 finale, and hereby the series finale of The Troop, opens with the Lakewood Troop hanging out together with Cadence and outwardly confirming her to be a part of their friend group, much to her excitement. Her moment to personally celebrate being accepted is interrupted, however, as a unit from Troop International arrives to capture Cadence and berate the Troop for harboring a dangerous blood thrasher, going through with Troop protocol of sending her to the monster world themselves. Mr. Stockley suggests to them that they should break her out of the temporary containment cell and play hero while he distracts the leader of the unit with a school tour. They manage to disguise themselves as guards sent to relieve the other two members of the unit in order to break Cadence out. And once she's free, they have Hayley lead her to the diner to brief her on taking Stockley's car in order for her to ditch town and lay low for a while until things cool down. Speaking of cool down, an ice ghoul, just like the monster we saw at the very top of the season, arrives at the school, transforming an air conditioning repairman into an ice zombie to do his bidding, which causes a chain reaction wherein he transforms more people into ice zombies, who then turn even more people into ice zombies. A snowball effect, if you will. Please don't. While Hayley sends Cadence away, Jake and Kirby reconvene with Stockley to discover the outbreak of ice zombies, deducing that they'll end up infecting as many people as possible before all congregating at the ice skating rink for the ice ghouls feeding. In the chaos, the unit of Troop International ends up zombified, as does Stockley as he sacrifices himself once they get cornered. The troop reunites at the diner, finding themselves surrounded by ice zombies. Suddenly, in a big hero moment, Cadence returns, having run into an ice zombie at the edge of town that tried to turn her into one of them, a process that failed due to her monster side resisting the effects. She crashes Stockley's car into the building and rescues Jake and Hayley, while Kirby ends up overwhelmed. Cadence brings Jake and Hayley to the ice rink, where the ice ghoul is waiting, and the ice zombies soon arrive behind them. Kirby is revealed to have not actually turned, simply convincing the zombies he did with a disguise kit. In the final stand, Cadence ends up distracting a group of zombies that try to turn her into one, Kirby provides cover to Jake as he goes to attack the ice ghoul, and Hayley gets turned while attempting to provide similar cover. While fighting the ice ghoul, Jake once again gets frozen into a block of ice, incapacitating him. It looks like all is lost until Cadence looks back on the moments throughout the episode where Jake, Hayley, and Kirby each showed Cadence friendliness and selflessness in order to protect her, motivating her and giving her the strength she needs to go monster and get the ice zombies off of her. She leaps into the ice ghoul's mouth and slashes it apart from the inside out, destroying it, freeing Jake from his block of ice, and reversing the effects of zombification on the entire town. Back at Troop HQ, the unit of Troop International continue with their arrest of Cadence, explaining that there's only one way to deal with her, much to the objections of the Lakewood Troop after the heroism she just displayed. They finish their explanation by going against protocol to offer Lakewood a fourth member to their troop, asking Cadence to join. She emphatically accepts, and the season, as well as unfortunately the series as a whole, ends with a shot of Jake, Hayley, Kirby, and Cadence huddled in a hug very similar to their dance together a couple episodes previous. And thus, with plenty more adventures to have with the troop newly strengthened into a group closer knit than they ever seemed before, the show just ends. And considering the years it took to develop this resolution, I would say it didn't go out with a bang, nor even a whimper, but with one long, drawn-out, shaky yet unnervingly quiet breath. In many ways, Season 2 makes little effort to match up to Season 1, in quite a literal sense. The handling of David Del Rio's departure from the show feels particularly clunky. The show treats itself like an estranged comic book, with creatures and conflicts that rarely present themselves as if they were from the same universe as the examples from Season 1. The show's overall mood and identity starkly contrast what we had grown used to. The special effects and set designs looked more outlandish and cartoony, and Nickelodeon made no secret of the fact that they were handling a property they wanted nothing to do with anymore. Although that said, I give the season a lot more credit for providing us some more compelling overarching character arcs, and ultimately putting in some effort at the tail end of it all to make the group dynamic feel much more purposeful, enthralling, and wholesome. In the last season, I took some time to spotlight some favorite monsters of mine, and this time around it's a bit more difficult to do that simply because I don't happen to be particularly into these neon-colored supervillain creature designs we usually saw this season, but that doesn't mean that there aren't a few standouts. In Mirrors, we saw perhaps this season's best attempt at horror, as Cadence finds herself being pulled into a mirror by a strange, paranormal being after seeing a specter calling for help from inside the mirror. The Reflector Lupanus, a monster that travels through mirrors and is ultimately shattered by a high-pitched audio feedback, operates on a more fantastical version of the specific kind of super practical horror I've stated on record before as being significantly frightening to myself. The horror trope I simply call mirror shit. Unfortunately, as much as this episode attempts to give horror another go, if I were to put it next to the scarier moments of Season 1, the silly VFX and the style in which many other characters get captured by this monster ends up making it not live up all that much to those moments. In Start Me Up, Kirby finds himself at odds with a girl named Morgan, who follows him into every scenario he enters as a means to get close to him, which he sees as an attempt to constantly one-up him. She visits Lakewood High to join the science fair with Kirby, having built a butler robot in Kirby's likeness. To further impress him, she steals a monster from confinement back at her troop in Tulsa, Oklahoma, a spark monster to be specific, to enter the robot and give it life. This backfires, and they ultimately have to destroy the robot to recontain the spark monster, but I bring this episode up for 3 reasons. 1, the official still render of the spark monster on the official website has a watermark from the stock photo company they got the texture from, and I think that's hilarious. 2, this is the second time they did an episode about a character having a robot double of themselves built that they share the screen with, after Double Felix, and both end with the robot turning evil and trying to take over the world, and I think that's hilarious. 3, this episode gives a bit more of a focused look into Kirby's origins. It's not the first, nor only time these details are mentioned in the show, but Kirby is explained to be able to fund his inventions that rarely work as intended as a result of his family's massive wealth. And, as I said, Kirby transferred to Lakewood from Tulsa, Oklahoma. Putting these 2 details side by side feels kinda something, when you note that the Greenwood district in Tulsa happened to have once been called Black Wall Street for being a financial capital for Black Americans, Until, of course, the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921, the single worst incident of racial violence in American history, where a militia of white supremacists, armed by city officials, burned the district to the ground in an act of terrorism, with upwards of 200 black people murdered. A lot of the instigation of this arrived from white Tulsans struggling to fit into the labor market in this community built by freedmen and feeling pretty entitled to it, as white people are known to be. Now, to have a white character from this town a few generations later absolutely swimming in granddaddy's money... Kirby stutters out a claim in his first appearance that his grandfather invented the dissolving sock that disappears in the washer, but I think the reality of where this wealth accrued is much darker. Anyway, the last monster I wanted to highlight was Gibby. It's Gibby. You know, like from iCarly. Except, it's actually Noah Monk playing a character known as the Sniffer, described as the most annoying being in the universe. In A Sniff Too Far, he's pulled out of a high-security cell to be conscripted into finding the ventilation tunnel of the flaying pincher mole, a monster stealing things around the school to build a nest for its babies, which then steals students from the school to feed to its babies. The Sniffer stalls on this task for a long time, wanting to spend as much time with the troop as possible while he can, since they wouldn't otherwise tolerate his obnoxiousness. After eventually helping the troop destroy the moles, he's granted freedom into the monster world. But when he's sent through the portal, the monsters throw him back through because they find him just as annoying. Eventually, he's sent to assist a Dutch division of the troop in dealing with their own flaying pincher mole problem, which turns out to be an appropriate destination for him due to this show's running gag about the Dutch troop being despised for unknown reasons. It's definitely a far cry from the delightful absurdity and surprising mental acuity depicted in Kelsey Grammer's Dr. Cranius, but hey, they had Gibby be a monster in the troop. What a get! Now, I grew up absolutely attached to this show, and when I was a kid, I was genuinely fascinated at the fact that none of my peers had the same experience as me. And I recognize that this isn't necessarily unique to this show. There are plenty of examples of television programs that have fallen entirely by the wayside due to a lack of viewership and fandom, but in my experience, this doesn't seem to be the most usual experience with children's programming. The nostalgia that people feel for the things they watched as kids is the lead drive for uncovering lost media or clarifying random memories from a time when life was simpler but also foggier to look back on. There are several stories of the most obscure, random pieces of children's programming being adamantly hunted down to bizarre lengths, from long-forgotten animated shorts to advertisements and promotional material sought after for the archival of every piece of SpongeBob SquarePants media, for example. Today, shows from my childhood that have very little presence in modern times are ones that I still see circulate conversation despite my own lack of interest in them as a kid. All as a result of a large enough group of people my age sharing the experience of these shows in their childhood, for better or for worse. Media serves an important purpose for us as social creatures. It allows us to share similar experiences without having to have grown in the exact same conditions, location, or time as the people you are interacting with. So, lost and obscure media being recalled by a handful of people at once manages to be a fun bonding exercise with relative strangers. I like to imagine that perhaps this video manages to perform such a task, and I'd love to know just how many people had any experiences with this show. Were you also obsessed with this show as a kid? Do you have vague memories that this show did, in fact, exist? Are you surprised to even hear that Nickelodeon ever had a show like this, despite being an avid viewer of the network in its time? What is your experience with The Troop? I'd love to gauge the internet's thoughts, because so far the people in my personal circles, including friends of the channel who regularly reflect on media we remember from childhood, have been completely blindsided by the existence of this show, despite the popularity of the channel it aired on and shows it aired next to. Perhaps it's the style and genre of the show not quite being in fashion when the show was made that caused kids my age not to be so attached compared to things like iCarly or SpongeBob. Perhaps it was the handling of the marketing and distribution of the show by Nickelodeon that absolutely fucked it over. Perhaps it was the show's identity crisis and missteps with handling smaller details in the content of the series itself. Or maybe it wasn't any single one of these reasons. And instead, all three of them. The way I see it, these three aspects served as an interconnected web of issues, and trapped in the center of it all was a show my young self had cherished. Kids generally weren't particularly attached to the show as much as other shows. What Nick saw was a program underperforming, and as a result, rather than give it the push to perhaps become a mainstay flagship vessel simply by insisting on airing it in more prime time slots, they just put it out into the world until finding a point where they could quietly dump the remaining episodes in even more disjointed times on a side channel. This, in turn, results in even worse ratings, and those worse ratings would cause a feedback loop that just digs a hole deeper and deeper. Meanwhile, what I see from the show itself is an attempt by the creators to remedy the lack of audience retention with a reworking of the show's style. And while in better circumstances that might have been just the thing they needed to boost the show, I think it had the opposite effect of alienating established viewers and thus further lowering the ratings. All of these aspects seem to stack up to unfortunately condemn this obscure show to an even deeper pit of obscurity. And now, here we are. Years later, a show that is an afterthought to the network and to most audience members, if even a thought in the first place to them, it haunted my memory for years as an unfulfilled piece of undiscovered greatness. And do I still feel that way upon returning to the show, ending the incidental 10-year hiatus of my process of exploring its content? Well, maybe. What I see in the show now is fond childhood memories, random moments of notable issues and subtext I found worth discussing, and a somewhat interesting story to tell about its existence. And while I generally had an enjoyable experience rewatching the show and finally finishing it, it's not necessarily a mind-blowing hidden gem as much as it is just a show that existed. What we cover today is less something to campaign a revival of. It's not secretly the greatest show of all time. It's kind of just an average show that I happen to be fond of and was surprised to see so few others who even knew it existed. In all honesty, as is typically the case with lost or obscure media, this is an example of a piece of media's obscurity being its most interesting aspect in and of itself. Does that mean I regret diving deep into this show's content? No. It was a fun, therapeutic recollection and analysis of something I enjoyed then and enjoyed now. And being able to congregate my thoughts on the show in one place and share with you all my favorite moments is rightfully exciting. And I hope you all had fun joining me on this ride. As a reminder, if we hit 10,000 subscribers by the end of the year, I'll be doing a video on the indie video game Undertale, and if we hit 20,000 subscribers, I'll be doing a video on the indie video game Tattletale. So make sure to check and see if you've done your part in helping us reach that goal. You can also follow me on Twitter at HippieRizat, and if you really enjoyed this video and my other projects, you can directly support me at patreon.com/hippierat. Also, my friend Quentin Reviews is currently in the midst of his large-scale project of a similar format where he does a season-by-season analysis of iCarly, really going as deep into the franchise as he can, including ties to other shows and its merchandising. Go subscribe to Quentin now so you don't miss a single one of these uploads. Finally, you can catch me on the YouTube channel Hippie Rat Lives or Hippie Rat Lives, both names are correct, where I host my live stream VODs, including a backlog of horror read-alongs, ghost video debunking, and other challenges and activities I streamed live at twitch.tv/thehippierat. Go check those out as well, and of course, don't forget to subscribe here to myself, and I've been Hippie Rat. Thank you very much for tuning in, and cheers to the future. Love yourself, and good night.